Drawing a cozy mouse is easier than you think, and I'm going to show you exactly how you can do it, no matter your skill level.
Hello wonderful people, it's Genevieve, and my goal here on this channel is to teach you all about illustration and design. So if you're new, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of the weekly videos, and so that you can join our wonderful creative community. And with that said, grab your drawing tools, and let's get started. Now the first step is pretty easy. If you want to have the best watercolor texture possible, you need to import some sort of a paper texture in your file before starting to draw. And for that you have a few different options. So if you check the description of this video, you're going to find a link to my freebies bundle, which is the Procreate Jumpstart kit. And within that kit, I have a couple of paper texture. So you could go ahead, pause the video and download that. It comes with instructions on how to install the texture within Procreate. So you could totally go with that. Otherwise, if you do have a pre-textured file, I know a lot of brush creators, including myself, we do provide these textured files, which are essentially just Procreate canvases with textured layer within them. So if you have one of those, whether it is mine or someone else's, doesn't matter, you could also start with that. So essentially here the goal is just to start with some sort of paper texture, no matter where it comes from, it doesn't matter. So once you have your paper texture, we're going to start with a very rough sketch. So go ahead and create a new layer. Make sure it is below any texture you might have, whether it is a group or just a single layer. And rename that new layer to Sketch. Now for the sketch, you can really use any color of your choice because we're not going to see it in the final result, so it doesn't matter. I usually like to sketch with just a neutral gray. And in this video, as always, I'm going to suggest a few different brush options. So I'm going to give you free Procreate brush options, and I'm also going to suggest brushes from my big brush bundle, so part of the Watercolor pack. Now these brushes are not essential at all, but they can help you save time because they are made to look watercolor, so they have color variation within them. They have a little bit of that randomness to make your piece look more organic. So if you want to check them out, again, not essential at all, but they will be linked in the description below, and there's always a special promo code for the YouTube people. Now for the sketch though, the brushes really don't matter much because again, we're not going to see the sketch in the final result, so just pick anything you're comfortable with. That could mean if you're working with free brushes, going in the sketching pack and picking the HB pencil. But if you do have my big brush bundle, you could pick from the Watercolor pack the coloring pencil. And from there, we're going to draw a very loose circle, which is going to be the head of the mouse. And then another one at the bottom, which is roughly going to be the same size, and that's going to help us map out the body. We're also going to draw two more circles that are going to be slightly smaller, one for each ear. And then we're going to draw a slightly curved vertical line and a slightly curved horizontal line onto the head, which is what I call the plus sign, and this is going to help us place the different facial features. Now, since this is a mouse, we might want to thicken up the bottom of the face because usually she would have a bit of a pointy nose. So you could just go ahead and slightly change the shape of your circle here. And from there, we can add a cute little nose at the intersection of the plus sign, as well as two closed eyes on the horizontal line. I'm also going to add a small little smile here, but you could experiment with different facial expressions if you want. I'm just keeping mine really simple and super cute. Now next we're going to sketch the sweater. In my mind, she's wearing a huge oversized sweater. So you can go ahead and draw this bell shape around the circle. Maybe adding a bit of a turtleneck. So you can just add a rounded rectangle at the top of the bell shape. You can also add two cute feet just poking out from the bottom of the shirt, kind of like this. And you can also add the thickness at the bottom of the shirt, like it's a chunky little knit. So kind of like the turtleneck, but at the bottom instead. And you can maybe make it curve a little bit above the feet, just to show that, yeah, the legs would be under right there. Now in my mind, I want the mouse to be holding a cup of hot chocolate. So I'm going to draw a very simple cup shape right here. And then I'm going to add little teardrop shapes for the hands. And for the arms, you can just go ahead and draw really thick, kind of round moon shapes. And the last little thing we have to sketch here is just a tail, and I want mine to be really swirly. So starting from the back and then just creating that spiral right here. And I know this looks crazy right now, but bear with me, trust the process. We're going to make it look good when we start adding the colors and the details. But the reason we are starting with a very rough sketch is that one, it's really quite quick and easy, but it also allows you to change the structure of your character before you spend a lot of time adding the colors. So at this stage, if you're not super happy with anything about your character, whether it is the proportion or just the angle of different elements, what you can do is use your selection tool here at the top, setting it to freehand, and then you can just select any of your basic shapes. Let's say I don't like the foot here. I'm just going to select the foot, and with the arrow tool you can then move that around. You can resize the different shapes, you can rotate them. So you can really just take all the little basic shapes you have and move them around until you have a structure or a skeleton that you're really happy with. So feel free to pause the video here, take all the time you need to move stuff around until you're really happy with your basic mouse sketch, and then we're going to start adding the colors. Great, so once you have a rough sketch that you're happy with, again, it doesn't need to look good, as long as you're happy with the general proportions and the structure, we're going to start adding the colors. So go ahead and open up your layer panel, and tapping on the little N next to the check mark on your sketch layer, go ahead and pick multiply from the list. And having the sketch layer set to multiply is going to help us see that sketch really well no matter what we paint underneath. And that's also going to allow us to still see the sketch well even if we lower the opacity. So go ahead and lower the opacity of your layer until you can just barely see your sketch. I'm going to keep mine a little bit more opaque so you can see it in my video. And then we're going to create a new layer that we're going to put under the sketch. And on that layer, we're going to paint the sweater. So rename that layer to sweater. And here for the sweater, you can really have any color of your choice. If I'm honest here, this illustration is inspired by a toy that my little puppy has, which is, I think it's Heather Sweater Weather or Sweater Weather Heather, it doesn't really matter. It's from Barkbox, and it's a gray mouse with a red sweater. So I'm gonna have a red sweater here, but you could really have whatever. If you want to have the same color as I have, though, really easy. I'm going to add the X code for that color on the top right here. And so what you would do is just go in the value section here of your color panel, and you would add the X code right here. So you just tap on that and then you type it in. So I'm personally going to pick a really nice bright red. As you can see, super saturated and really quite bright as well. Now in terms of brushes here, we want something that has either a watercolor effect or at least a lowered opacity. So if you're working with free brushes that come with Procreate, you could go ahead and simply pick from the airbrushing pack the hard brush. But the trick here is to lower the opacity of your brush. So probably setting it around 40%. It doesn't need to be exact. But essentially what you want, that's way too small. Essentially what you want here is just to have some sort of an overlap when you do overlap some strokes. So again, free option would be the hard brush from the airbrushing pack, but with lowered opacity. If you do have my big brush bundle though, you would pick from the watercolor pack, of course, the Dark Edges watercolor. And here we're going to go ahead and we're going to color block the different elements without lifting the pencil. So what I mean by that is we're going to draw, for example, the turtleneck part all in once without lifting the pencil, then one arm without lifting the pencil, the other arm without lifting the pencil, and you get the idea. Now the lowered opacity as well as just the watercolor effect is really super useful because that's how we're going to create, well, the watercolor feel in our piece. But we want the overlaps to be really intentional. So within each element, we're going to try for now not to have overlaps, so we're going to try not to lift our pencil. If you do end up lifting your pencil and creating overlaps, It's really not the end of the world. We're going to blend everything later anyway, but as much as you can, just try avoiding creating overlaps within one element. But you can see already, because I have those overlaps in the areas around the arm, in the areas around the neck, I'm already getting this kind of darker red, which is going to be really beneficial to create the shadows, but also, yes, the watercolor effect. Now, once you have your color blocking done, we're just going to go over and we're going to add some very basic, simple shadows, mostly to help us see the different elements. So with the same color and the exact same brush, you can just layer your strokes whenever you want to have a shadow. So I'm going to add a shadow on the left side of my character, but you can have a completely different light scenario if you want. So just starting with something simple like this, and then maybe layering my strokes even more to have an even darker red on the very far left. Might add a little bit on the right as well, especially in that kind of arm fold or arm crease, whatever it would be. Maybe adding some on the left arm, the left part of the turtleneck. The bottom of the sweater. As you can see, it's nothing really precise here. We just want to add a bit of color variation again, and also use that as an excuse to start creating some shadows. Now, if you wanted here, you could also add some ridges in your sweater, like ribbing. And to do that, again, just same brush, same color, you can just add some vertical lines along the body of the sweater. And I know right now, it looks absolutely crazy. Again, once more, trust the process. Right now, we're just adding all the different color elements. We're just color blocking everything. And once we're done color blocking, we're going to blend, which is going to make it look way less crazy, but also make it look like watercolor. So for now, just bear with me, color block everything. You can laugh at me if you think this looks crazy. That's totally okay, but don't give up just yet. Again, trust the process. So once you're done color blocking your sweater, we're going to move on to color blocking the mouse. So just go ahead and create a new layer and rename that new layer to mouse. Now this layer, make sure it is above the sweater because we're going to have the feet and the hands, so we need to make sure we can see those above the red. So below the sketch, but above the sweater. And you can really have any color mouse of your choice here. I want mine to be kind of a purpley gray. So just gray, but then instead of red, more on the purple side. I'm not sure why, I just think it looks really nice. So pretty much middle of the way in terms of brightness, but otherwise super desaturated, this kind of indigo here. And it's going to be the exact same strategy here. We're going to color block the different elements without lifting the pencil. So starting with the ears, and then maybe the face, the hands, and the feet. Honestly, here I could have gone with a bigger brush, but it's okay. Even if there are little gaps, doesn't matter. Again, we're going to blend everything. That's just going to add more color variation. So that's totally fine. Then we're going to do the hands and the feet. Now right now the hands and the feet are probably going to look quite crazy because since we have brush with transparency in them, we can see the shirt, but we're going to fix that when we start blending everything and when we start adding the details. So for now, don't worry about it. As long as you have your basic color blocking, that's really all that matters. Now, just like we did for the sweater, we're also going to overlap our strokes to start adding shadows and color variation. So in my case, my shadow is on the left, so just same thing here on the left of the head. I'm just going to overlap my color a few times. Something like this. And then just to help separate the ear and the face, I'm going to add a bit of a shadow there as well. And maybe a little bit on the bottom of the feet, or the bottom left of the feet. Just because otherwise it would be a little bit too flat in my opinion. Now the last element we have to color block is the cup, but the cup is white. And if you use white with a brush that either has lowered opacity or a watercolor brush, it's just not going to turn out super good. So go ahead and create a new layer above your mouse, above your sweater, rename it to cup. And just go ahead, everyone, we're all going to pick in the airbrushing pack the hard brush, and we're all going to set the opacity back up to 100%. So essentially here we just want a regular brush. And here we're going to go ahead and just pick pure white. I often get questions on which size brush to use. As you can see, it's all about testing. I personally don't have specific brush sizes for anything. I just kind of go around, test, and change as I go until I find something that seems like it would work well. So I really encourage you to try and do the same thing. It's not about one specific brush size. That's not going to make or break your illustration. I think it's really important that you start getting comfortable picking brush sizes by yourself, because in the end, it really doesn't matter, but that's one little thing that you can practice getting more comfortable with. And that's going to make you feel maybe a little bit more empowered and more confident in creating your own illustrations. So yeah, just experiment. Try a few little brush sizes. If it seems like it's not going to work out well, just try something else. And you can always change as you go. So it's really, really low stake. We might also want to go ahead and add a bit of smoke, so just a new layer once more, renaming that new layer to smoke. And still with our white and our hard brush, we're going to draw this little smoky shape. You can draw 1, 2, or 3 of those. That's really up to you. And just to make it look a little bit more like smoke, you might want to go ahead and lower the opacity of that smoke layer. So just tapping on the end next to the check mark, just like we did for the blending modes, and then lowering the opacity to whatever you want. You get to just decide here. I'm probably going to set mine around 50%. Oh, and I almost forgot, we need something in our cup. So going back on the cup layer or creating a new layer, that's totally up to you. Picking whatever color you want the beverage to be. I'm just going to go with a brown for hot chocolate, so something really rich, kind of on the red side more than orange, to be honest, but pretty much middle of the way in terms of the saturation, a little bit darker than bright, but pretty much in the middle as well. Great, so at this stage we have pretty much everything color blocked. We just need to make it look good because right now it looks absolutely crazy. So we're going to do that by adding some details, by blending the colors. But before we add those details and blend the colors, we're going to add a few highlights as well, because right now everything is super dark. And for the highlights, we're just going to use the eraser, and no matter which option you're using in terms of brushes, so free brushes that come with Procreate or brushes from my big brush bundle, we are all going to set our eraser tool to, in the airbrushing pack that comes with Procreate, the soft brush. And with that soft brush, we're just going to erase a few details, mostly on the mouse. So going back on your mouse layer, we're just going to gently erase the top of the head. Just a little bit. You don't want it to be fully white, but just a little bit paler than the rest. And then 2 little cheeks here on either side of the face. We might also want to erase a little bit in the ears. Again, just to add that kind of color variation, but this time more in terms of light than shadows. And I know I just said we're mostly going to focus that on the mouse, but I feel like this side of the sweater could be a little bit brighter. So I'm just going to select the sweater and erase a little bit of the arm. Same strategy, same idea, but just on a different layer. And at this stage, we're ready to blend. So we're going to start with the sweater because I feel like it looks really crazy right now. And just so we see what we're blending a little bit better, you might want to go ahead and hide your sketch layer. So just unchecking the check mark here. And depending on the brushes you're using, you have a few different options of tools to use. So if you've been working with free Procreate brushes, you're going to use the smudge tool, which is this little finger icon here at the top. And you're going to set that to really any of the brushes from the painting pack. So you get to really experiment here and see which vibe you prefer. In most of my more illustrations, so not watercolor videos, I usually use the stucco brush because I really like the texture that it has, so you could experiment with that, but it might be a little bit too strong for the watercolor feel, so you could experiment with something like Spectra maybe, anything that looks soft and watery you can really play with and see if you like the vibe of it. Maybe even acrylic could work well here. So just test a few options and then pick whichever one you prefer. That's totally up to you. But if you do have my watercolor brushes from the big brush bundle, we're going to set our paintbrush, so not the smudge tool, really the paintbrush, to the water blender. So if I find my watercolor pack right here, at the very bottom we have the water blender. And all we have to do here is blend any weird edge that we don't like. So anything that looks too digital or too crazy, we're just going to go over and blend. Now, if you're using my watercolor brushes, so my water blender, you're going to notice essentially, if you just go over one of these seams, it's going to blend it really nicely and it's going to look super organic. So you can really just go over any seam that you want very quickly, maybe once or twice, and it's going to look a little bit more like watercolor, or quite a lot more like watercolor actually. That being said, if you are using the smudge tool, no matter which brush you use, there's not going to be that randomness within the stroke. So if you just go over, well, that's way too big. But if you just go over a stroke, you're going to see it's going to blend it, but it's going to still look really digital. So instead of just going over a stroke normally, you're going to have to manually add that kind of squiggle in your arm to add that randomness within your blending manually. So that's just something you need to keep in mind. But again, if you're using my watercolor brushes, so the water blender, you don't really have to worry about that. You can just go over your strokes a few times and they're going to blend really nicely. And with that, it is time for the secret password. So if you've watched this far in the video, please go ahead and leave a comment with the word sweater. Now, if you're new on the channel, you might be a little bit confused with what is the secret password thing. Essentially, it's a game that we play. In all of my illustration videos, I hide a secret password for you to find and then comment. And that does a few things, one of them being just fun for me because you see my face in the intro, you hear my voice throughout the entire video, you kind of have an idea of who I am, but I have no clue who you are, and whenever you leave a comment, no matter what the comment is, I get to sometimes see your face, sometimes see your name, sometimes just see your username even, and that's really nice for me to see who's part of the creative community that we're building here on the channel. So that's reason number one. Reason number two is for you, and it is that the secret password, when I put it in the video, it does give me a lot of insight into how to edit and pace a video better, and as simple as it is, it does help me create better tutorials for you. So if you've watched this far, again, just go ahead and leave a comment with the word sweater, and then we're going to keep going. And then we're going to do the same thing on the mouse layer. So just switching layer, but then keeping either the smudge tool or the water blender and blending anything that doesn't look quite right. Now the key here is not to overblend though, because if you overblend and everything looks super smooth, it's going to not really look like watercolor. So you do want to have some of that organic flow within your colors, just like you would have with regular, like real life watercolor pigments. So blending everything when it looks too digital like this, but not to the point where everything is super smooth. Great! Now we're going to add even more color variations and shadows and lights on our characters, focusing mostly on the sweater. So going back on the sweater layer, you're going to use your selection tool here, making sure again it is set to freehand and that the color fill option here is deactivated. That's super important. And you're going to draw a kind of wobbly selection on the same side on which you have your shadows. So in my case, on the bottom left. And you are going to feather that selection. So just tapping on feather right here at the bottom. And the amount of feathering is going to depend on the size of your canvas, but it's probably going to be somewhere between 20 and 30%. So you can really experiment with both. It doesn't need to be any specific number. You just want to have some sort of feathering, because essentially what the feathering does here, you can think of it as it's creating a gradient in your selection, which means then we can go in the adjustment panel here at the top. You can pick hue, saturation, and brightness. And if you do go ahead and play with those little sliders, you're going to be able to add that color variation, but it's going to look smooth like a gradient in the piece. For example, here, again, I said I was going with shadows, so I can lower my brightness. But you can see it's affecting only the left bottom side of my character because that's what is selected, but it's affecting it, or it's creating that color variation smoothly, so it doesn't look like it's a harsh line, it's really smooth. So yeah, I might lower my brightness. Maybe I can experiment with changing the hue a little bit, making it a little bit more blue, so moving it towards the left. I don't think I want to play with my saturation here, although maybe I could lower it a little bit. That could look good. And you can repeat these steps however many times you want, so you could go ahead and add lights just on the opposite side. So again, just a wobbly selection, feathering that selection somewhere between 20 and 30%. Using in the adjustment panel, the hue, saturation, brightness tool. And then this time I would probably just increase the brightness to add a bit of light. And if you're working with the free brushes here, so you don't have necessarily a lot of color variation within the brushes, well, you don't have any color variation within the brush, you can also use that technique to add just absolutely random variation within your piece. So not focusing on shadows or lights, just drawing any kind of weird, messy blob. Again, making sure you feather that blob, otherwise it's going to look crazy. Probably around 20% here, so a little bit less feathering, but still using in the adjustment panel, hue, saturation, and brightness. And here mostly focusing on playing with the hue. So you can see that's going to add, if I'm exaggerating it here a lot, it's going to add that color variation on some elements of your piece. And so you could repeat that a few more times, like 2 or 3 times, and start adding that kind of randomness of the pigments that I was talking about earlier. If you do have my watercolor brushes though, that kind of variation is already in the brushes, so you could just skip that step altogether. And the last few things we have to do here is add details and figure out these kind of weird overlaps that we have to really bring this piece together and make it look good. So go ahead and create a new layer above any of the color blocking layers you have, but still below the textures. And rename that new layer to details. Now the details here are mostly going to be, at least in my case, you might decide to draw a pattern or something like that on the shirt, but in my case I'm mostly going to focus on just the facial features as well as the tail. And so for that I'm going to use a nice dark charcoal gray, maybe that has a little bit of brown to it, so kind of the same brown color I use for the beverage, but just way less saturated and even darker. And here in terms of brushes, you have a few different options that could work really well. If you're working with free brushes that come with Procreate, you could go back to the sketching pack, so what you use for the sketch, and use the 6B pencil. That's going to allow you to have a little bit of textures in your details, so kind of like you were going back with a coloring pencil. If you want more smooth details, you could go in the inking pack, picking the studio pen and lowering the opacity of the brush just like you did for the hard brush when you were color blocking. So that would be more of like a thin paintbrush and still watercolor as opposed to coloring pencil. If you do have the watercolor pack with my big brush bundle, you also have those two options. So you could either pick the coloring pencil if you want that same texture, or if you want to have more, again, of that watercolor effect all through the entire piece, you could pick the thin, intense watercolor. And I'm going to take that as an opportunity to tell you about the brushes. Depending on the version of Procreate you have, the brushes kind of changed a little bit, and I just noticed that when I was preparing that tutorial. So if you have my big brush bundle and you want to use a thin, intense watercolor, you might notice that you're not able to get the most thin results. And that's kind of from a change that happened with a Procreate update, but it's a really easy fix. You can just double tap on the thin, intense watercolor brush. And if you go in the property options here at the bottom, in the brush behavior section here, you're going to lower the minimum size slider to 0% or none. And that way you're going to be able to get down to really thin, precise strokes. Not sure what happened in that Procreate update. That's a little bit annoying, but again, you can just do those little steps and fix it really quickly. And then no matter which brush you're using, no matter which option you want, we're going to all reactivate our sketch so we can see what we have to draw. But then otherwise really easy, just experimenting with different brush size until you find one that you like, and then just tracing over the facial features and the tail. Now when you're drawing the nose, you might want to add a bit of a highlight at the top, so just leaving these little shapes at the top uncolored. And the tail here, the key is really to draw it a few times until you get a shape that you're really happy with. So there's no point just erasing a section and then trying to redraw that section. It's not going to look smooth and flowy. You're much better just undoing and redoing until you get a shape that you're happy with. Even if that takes 50 tries, it's really worth it. And one thing I forgot in the sketch is the whiskers, so just adding 3 little whiskers like this on either side of the face. I think it makes the character look extra cute. Then you can go ahead and deactivate your sketch just to make sure that everything is mapped out. And I know I said I was going to go with the watercolor option, but I'm going to actually switch at this point to the textured option, so the coloring pencil if you have my watercolor brushes, or the 6B pencil if you're working with free Procreate brushes. And I'm going to color pick the color of my mask here, and I'm just going to use it to close the shapes that are opened from when I erased. So essentially just drawing a very thin outline. That might be too dark actually. Yeah, a very thin outline on the side of the face, just to make it look like it's closed and it's not just endless face. And honestly, at this point, you might as well just refine any weird edge that you don't like, especially the corners between different shapes. They might be a little bit too round, so you can use that brush here just to refine them a little bit. Now we're also going to go back on the sweater layer and we're going to erase the parts of the sweater that are overlapping with the mouse because it just looks crazy right now. So you could go ahead straight with your eraser onto your sweater layer if you want. I feel like we worked really hard on the sweater, so I'm going to use what is called a mask. So if you just tap on the sweater layer, you're going to have this layer menu here that opens on the left, and you can select mask at the bottom. And you're going to see that's going to create a layer mask above your sweater layer. And essentially, if you go ahead and erase on that mask, I'm going to give you an example real quick. So I'm going to set my eraser to the hard brush here, just so that I have hard edges in my eraser. But then if I go ahead, I can essentially erase my sweater. But you can see that the shape that we erased is on the layer mask and not on the sweater itself, meaning if I was to just hide the layer mask, the sweater is still there. So that's just a little bit of safety. If I was to decide I want to move the foot around, somehow I could just move it on the mouse layer and then I could just delete that layer mask and start over again without having to redraw the sweater itself. So go ahead and erase any unwanted overlaps. It doesn't need to be super precise. If you have any overlaps, that can help it make it look a little bit less digital. I think that's a cool look actually. So you're probably gonna have to erase the feet, the hands. I think that should be good, but if you have anything else that you feel the need to erase, just go ahead and erase it at this stage. And we're also going to add a bit of a shadow under the mouse just so it doesn't look like it's floating quite as much. So go ahead and create a new layer below the sweater and rename that new layer to shadow. Now for the shadow, I'm actually going to use the same brown I used in my beverage, so it's still my history here, but otherwise you can see it's this kind of burnt red that is middle of the way in terms of saturation and really quite dark. And here, if you're working with free Procreate brushes, go ahead and set your brush to, from the airbrushing pack, the soft brush, making sure again you are lowering the opacity of your brush probably around 40%. If you do have my watercolor brushes though, go ahead and pick the color shifting blotches here. Now what we're going to do here is we're going to gently brush that dark color below the mouse, and we're going to layer our stroke to make it darker around the mouse itself. So essentially it's kind of fading the further away it is getting from the mouse. And in this kind of little area here between the feet, I'm going to make it really super dark. And last but not least, we're also going to add some splatters. So creating a new layer above everything, well, except the texture in effect, but above the details and above all the color blocking we've done. Renaming that new layer to splatters. And here we're going to use the blending mode linear burn so that the splatters kind of blend with the colors underneath, making it look even more like watercolor. Now here I'm going to pick my red that I used first, and I'm mostly going to focus the splatters on the shirt. And the options for free brushes are not great, if I'm honest. It's going to be in the spray painting pack, probably the G-Clay brush. There's one called Splatters, but I don't know, that doesn't look like watercolor to me, so you could go with that if you want, but I think the closest one would be the G-Clay brush. But as you can notice, it's really quite dense, so make sure you use it sparingly, and you can also go back with the eraser and just erase a few of the splatters so it's not quite as intense. If you do have my watercolor brushes though, go ahead and pick the splatter brush. And you're just going to be able to add a few splatters, focusing mostly on one side. I feel like if you add them everywhere, it looks a bit like a murder scene, and that's not what I want, personally at least. But focusing them around the shirt can just add a bit of texture and interest to the piece. Now, if you do have my watercolor brushes, what you can do as well is going back on the sweater layer and picking the salt brush. For the salt brush, the color doesn't really matter because it's a little bit more like a smudge tool. So what you would do is you would just start from a white part of your canvas and you would drag that onto your sweaters. And it's essentially adding these kind of inverse splatters, so just these white little speckles. And again, that just helps add a bit more texture to the piece. I feel like maybe not on a sweater, but that might look good on the mouse. I'm gonna try that real quick. Yeah, it's very subtle, but I think it really helps elevate the piece.
Now, if you enjoyed this video and want more Procreate watercolor tutorials, I highly recommend you check out this playlist because I have a bunch more for you. But before you leave, make sure to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the weekly videos I post every Tuesday and Saturday. Then click on the link right here, and I'll meet you there.